Good morning, my name's Lee Woods from Pennington Choices. Welcome to our fire safety webinar. Just a few housekeeping rules to start off the event. The session will be about 20 minutes and we're happy to have a discussion and take questions at the end of the session. If you'd like to submit a question, you can do this in two ways. Either in the live chat box, you will need a new YouTube account for this, or by emailing asktheexperts@pennington.org.uk. That's asktheexperts@pennington.org.uk. We'll endeavour to try and reply to all your questions. However, if you think of something after the event, please email in and we will get back to you with a response. Also, we will be sending a copy of this webinar and a transcript of the webinar to everybody who joins it, so don't feel the need to scribble loads of copious notes down. Okay, so ask yourself the following questions. Do you have clarity on the policy approach your organisation is taking to fire safety? If so, is it fit for now? And is it going to be fit for the future? Do your leaders and boards see fire safety as a strategic priority? Are they actively involved in the process of agreeing your policy approach? And do they assess subsequent performance? Why is it so important for fire safety to be a strategic priority? And are you as an organisation waiting for legislation to come into force? Or are you being proactive in developing a policy that is fit for now and fit for the future? One or two of you may recall Dame Judith Hackett made the comment that there is no reason to wait to start the process of behaviour change. Now it is clear what is coming and what is expected post-Grenfell. So let's just talk a little bit about the context in which we're operating. This ultimately is about keeping people safe. The challenge for most registered providers, though, is that the legislation and the approved codes of practice around fire safety are ambiguous. And this therefore leaves it for organisations to decide on what strategic approach to take in respect to fire safety. In addition to this, we've got increasing regulation and increasing scrutiny. We've got loads of potential new legislation and loads of potential new recommendations that are coming out from reviews. So we've got the Hackett Review of Building Regulations and Fire Safety from 2018. We've got the proposals for the reform of Building Safety Regulations System 2019. And there are really four key strands to that. That's about having clearer responsibilities for those managing buildings, having a clearer role for residents' voice, greater oversight from regulators through the role of the Joint Competency Authority, and then there is going to be tougher enforcement. In addition to that, we've got the government's call for evidence in 2019, which is seeking views on the fire regulatory reform order and whether or not that continues to be fit for purpose. And we've also got the phase 1 report from the Grenfell Tower inquiry, although that has focused very much on the response of the fire service. There will be other reviews to follow. In addition to this, we've got those tragic events of Lakanal back in 2009 and now Grenfell in 2017. And despite those two very significant events which had significant consequences and were tragic, there have been 11 significant fires in buildings between June 2019 and December 2019 alone. 5 of these were in blocks of flats in Hackney, South London, Brighton, Essex and Barking. We had 3 in hotels in Bristol, Walsall and Eastbourne, 1 in student accommodation in Bolton, 1 in an extra care scheme in Cheshire and 1 in a school in Dunfermline. And the majority of these buildings were timber frame construction and most led to either the significant loss of or total loss of the buildings. In addition to this, there are also thousands of leaseholders currently trapped because of the government's advice note number 14. This requires building owners of blocks over 18 metres to check for and remove non-aluminium composite material cladding. And effectively what this means for leaseholders is they can't get certificates to say the buildings comply with the advice note 14 if the building owners haven't done so. And effectively this is leading to zero valuations, leaseholders can't remortgage, leaseholders can't sell. So if you think about the context we're operating in, it's a very, very confusing time for register providers when knowing what to do when setting their policy approach around fire safety. And what's the current problem? Well, if you think about the current problem logically, in reality, the current law only requires building owners to do very little. A type 1 fire risk assessment to your communal areas only that is suitable and sufficient. And ultimately, it's left to you to decide if it is suitable and sufficient, and it's led for you to decide the level of competence you deploy in order to undertake that type 1 visual fire risk assessment. So you could argue that if you are doing a type 1 risk assessment to communal areas only and using an assessor without appropriate competence, you could argue you're meeting the minimum legal requirement. However, this will not keep your tenants, residents and visitors safe, that is for sure. The other issue there is no prescribed competency level or accreditation which the assessor or consultant must possess in order to carry out the fire risk assessment. So, problem in a nutshell, you don't have to do very much. There's no level of competency required, and ultimately that is not going to lead to keeping your tenants and residents safe. Managing fire safety in buildings requires so much more than that, and how much more you choose to do is for you, your leaders and your boards to decide upon. So firstly, what should your policy approach and framework look like? Well, firstly, you've got to be clear on what you will do. All this legislation, all these approved codes of practice, all this guidance, all these recommendations, ultimately you've got to decipher what you are going to do. And once you've decided what you are going to do, you then need to set out how you will deliver that. And the two things are, you need to keep the two things separate. Your policy should set out what you are going to do, and it should have a clear strategic intent in there around tenant safety being front and centre for boards and leaders. And the policy principles that you're going to apply within that policy need to be set against the backdrop of making the strategic choices based on your assessment of both the risk and the cost of managing fire safety across your portfolio. The how you will deliver things should come through your processes and procedures. Okay, so what are the issues you need to consider and the strategic choices you then have to decide upon? And there's a whole raft of things you need to think about, and therefore what should you cover in your policy? Firstly, you've got to think about the type of risk assessment that you are going to undertake on each and every building that you own that requires one. There are 4 types of fire risk assessments, and it may be that from a policy point of view, you need a mixed economy depending upon your stock profile. So one size won't necessarily fit all. Most organisations now we are seeing navigating towards doing type 3 surveys for most of their buildings, and obviously type 4 surveys where more intrusive type surveying is required, and certainly a move away from the standard type 1. You need to ensure your risk assessment is PAS 79 compliant, and that's effectively a British standard question set which your fire risk assessor should follow to assess all the necessary risks in those buildings. Residential accommodation attached to those communal blocks, what are you going to do about that? Do you do any of it? Do you do a sample of it? Or do you do all of it? Again, you need to decide and choose what your approach is going to be. With a type 3 survey, that would certainly pick up a sample of your residential units attached to the communal blocks and schemes that you have in your management. The frequency of risk assessments is often one that people are confused about. However, if you have a competent fire safety consultancy and risk assessors carrying out your fire risk assessments, they should be able to advise you as part of the fire risk assessment report on the required re-inspection frequency levels for each and every building that you've got. Under the 2012 fire safety in purpose-built blocks of flats, they've basically categorised this in 3 ways. So low-rise, low-risk flats, it's suggested you do a new fire risk assessment every 4 years and do an internal review, desktop review every 2 years. With high-risk properties, they are suggesting you do a new fire risk assessment every 3 years with an annual review. And then the highest risk, they are suggesting you do a new fire risk assessment every year. So if you think about your stock, your high-risk buildings are likely to be your high-rise, your sheltered schemes, your supported schemes. It's effectively suggesting you should be doing a new risk assessment every year on those blocks. Okay. The other thing to think about, and we talked about this earlier, is the competency of the fire risk assessor and what you will accept. You may choose to set out in your policy a standard and level of competency that you will operate with. Are your assessors on the National Accreditation Register? If not, have a think about that. We would recommend that you employ risk assessors who are on the National Accreditation Register. Are your consultants accredited through BAFA, IFE, UCAS? And do your managers internally who manage these fire safety programs have a fire safety qualification that will help upskill them to manage these programs in the most effective way? So the sort of NEBOSH type qualifications in fire risk and risk management are the types of qualifications that you might want to consider and think about. If you deliver fire risk assessments in-house, be careful and think about the issues around competency. It's not just about the competency of the individual doing the work if you're carrying it out in-house. It's also about the quality of auditing and the quality of quality control that you have in place to check and validate the work of your in-house fire risk assessors. Certainly we see that most fire risk assessors who are operating through internal processes are not subject to the same scrutiny as external accredited organisations. But that doesn't mean to say you can't run within an in-house fire risk assessor. Just make sure that you have the quality auditing and quality control processes in place, which will ensure that there's an independence and review to the work that those individuals are carrying out. Think about your actions. How are you going to classify those actions? How are you going to work with your fire risk consultant to assess classification of actions? And it's important to have a profile for your actions and have timescales and targets agreed, either as a policy principle or you default to your fire risk assessor, who should be able to provide you with those things. Also, you need to think about recommendations which are not mandatory actions, and whether or not you are going to carry out the recommendations which are not mandatory actions. The other issue to think about is the tracking and evidencing of both your fire risk assessment programme and the subsequent fire risk assessment actions. How's that going to work? How's that going to operate? How are you going to have visibility over the entire programme, over the entire set of actions that you've got to manage, etc., etc. And don't forget, with most fire risk assessments, you get your first wave of actions. There's then likely to be a second wave of actions that will come out of further survey work that needs to take place through audits, compartmentation surveys, etc. Okay. Also think about how you're going to track changes to your programme. So you need to be clear on your asset list, both your communal blocks, your commercial premises, etc., etc. But how are you going to track changes to that programme when properties are added, when properties are deleted, when there is a change of use, or after a fire incident? Because clearly you need to conduct a new fire risk assessment in any of those scenarios. What's your approach to evacuation? You need to decide this again as part of your policy. Is it stay put? Is it stay safe? Is it partial evacuation? Is it evacuate? And again, this is likely to depend on both the fire stopping and fire integrity within your buildings. Again, if you've got a competent, qualified fire risk assessor and fire safety consultancy, they should be able to help you assess that on a site-by-site basis. Probably having a blanket policy across your stock now is not what is going to work. You need to decide on your evacuation policy on a site-by-site basis. Also, what's your approach to common areas? Do you insist on sterile? Do you allow for a managed approach? Again, issues to consider when you are developing your policy. Fire door audits, new laws that potentially are coming in around assessing fire doors every 3 months. Are you geared up and ready for this? And have you considered what you're going to do? And have you considered how this is going to impact on both your policy and on your budgets? What about new build sites? What do you do around pre and post occupation of new build schemes? things to think about. What's your approach? Do you have servicing and maintenance contracts in place to cover all essential fire equipment? And if those contracts are in place, again, are they managed, tracked and evidenced in a way that you can see exactly where those services and inspections are taking place and when remedial actions are taking place? Resident communication. How are you taking feedback from residents? Are you publishing your fire risk assessments? How are you seeking feedback? Your electrical safety. Do you have a valid EICR on each and every one of your communal blocks and commercial premises? Because that will be required as part of the fire risk assessment. And then what about those properties or blocks you own which are managed by others? Be clear on this, that you cannot delegate the responsibility for fire safety to a third party. It may be that the third party has to carry out the fire risk assessment and the fire safety actions, but you as the landlord of that building need to have evidence that that is happening. So you're either seeking a fire risk assessment from your risk assessor or you're seeking a fire risk assessment from your third party, but both sets of properties should be on your programme. What about KPI and reporting? How are you going to ensure that this is highly visible within your organisation, both at operational, leader and board level? What about training? What about roles and responsibilities? Who's the strategic owner in your business for fire safety? Who's the operational owner for fire safety? Etc, etc. And finally, from a policy perspective, what's the approach for escalation if non-compliance is happening in your business? How does that work? How is it set out? Is it clear? And ultimately, if there is a non-compliance issue around fire safety, how quickly does that get to the senior leadership team and your board? So lots and lots of issues to consider there when you are thinking about developing your fire safety policy. As I say, we're going to send a transcript of this particular webinar, so all of those things I've just posed as questions you will see in the transcript, and feel free to sort of have a look at that transcript against your current policy and see whether or not there are any key issues that are missing. In summary, this is about keeping people safe. Look beyond the legislation, look beyond those minimum requirements and ask yourself, are we doing everything we can to keep our tenants and residents safe? We've had some early adopters and lessons learned that we've looked at, and clearly what is likely to happen in the sector is we're going to see a significant increase in spend on fire safety works across your portfolios nationally. London and Quadrant have reported that they expect their operating margins to fall by 4% a year over the next 5 years due to fire safety works. Salix have said that their costs will increase. Peabody have created a dedicated new fire safety team. Most providers have said that information management is a significant risk for them, their ability to manage and track what's going on through their safety programmes. Network Homes will end up paying £1.5 million per annum on Waking Watch for 450 homes that they have in West London until they can resolve the issues in relation to those blocks. And the G15 predict the bill for fire safety works for their members' stock will be close on £7 billion. So you can see this is a huge emerging area of safety for the RSL sector to get to grips with, and you need to have a policy in place which will help guide those principles. This is now about transformational change. It's not about step change. You need a vision for fire safety, you need to plan ahead, you need to put money aside, and you need to begin this process now. Leadership will be absolutely critical to this. It needs to be a strategic focus, and you need to consider your risk appetite around this. Look at what you have now, how it is used, and how it will be used differently going forward. What I would say is a clear policy framework will enable you to make decisions in a systematic way and be clear about what you need to do. So as I say, if you would like a copy of this transcript, we'll get that across to you, or if indeed you need any help or advice on your approach to fire safety, please do let us know. We would be happy to help. And now we're happy to take any questions that people might have.
Thanks, Lisa. We've got a few questions coming via the Ask the Experts email. So the first one is from Rachel, who asks, what is the hardest problem for providers to overcome when ensuring fire safety compliance? Okay,
well, I think you'll have seen from the issues I've just described there in detail, the complexity of the strategic choices you've got to consider and decide upon is probably the most significant challenge. Deciding upon and implementing that approach, there are so many issues to consider, so having a clear strategy and policy will absolutely help that. I think ensuring you've got competent people involved in this process is key. Both competency at a leadership level to understand the issues, competency in terms of agreeing the policy and your strategic choices, and then competency in those people carrying out the fire risk assessments, and competency in the supply chain for delivering fire safety works. Many providers are falling into the trap of allowing non-qualified contractors to carry out very specialist fire safety works, and that's something that you need to avoid. And then ultimately the management and evidencing of both your programs and your actions and where those things are up to, and keeping that highly visible and transparent in your business. Those are the sort of hardest things that people need to consider.
Also, another question from Colin, who has asked, I have conducted fire risk assessments on all of my properties, but how do I know that they've been carried out correctly and are up to the required standards?
Okay, thanks for that question, Colin. I think firstly, check are your fire risk assessments past 79 compliant. That's the British Standard question set, and that's an easy enough thing to do. Check whether both the type and frequency of fire risk assessments are relevant to each and every building that you have to manage. Check on the competency of the assessor stroke consultant. And then I think one thing that is very clear when you have a fire risk assessment done, when you are trying to understand whether or not it's fit for purposes, is the actions that come out of it. We see some organisations where there are fire risk assessments with no actions, and that leaves us highly suspicious of the quality of the fire risk assessment. So the quality of the actions that come out is also a thing to think about. So past 79, types and frequencies, competency of your assessor stroke consultant, and the actions that come out of that. And most importantly for you as an RP is make sure that you act upon those actions within the timescales and the time frames agreed.
And then finally, I've got a question from Steve, who asks, how frequently should I be undertaking a fire door audit?
Thanks for your question, Steve. The current guidance or the current requirement is to carry out inspections on your fire doors every 6 months, and this should be done by a competent person. The thing I would say though, Steve, is do bear in mind that the new recommendations around assessment of fire doors is suggesting that you're going to have to inspect all your doors on all your buildings on a 3-monthly basis in terms of checking whether or not those doors have working door closers. So it's currently 6 months, but you need to gear yourselves up for the fact that all fire doors may need to be inspected on a 3-monthly basis going forward in the future. That's not yet in law, but there's a chance that that will come into law in the not too distant future. Okay, I don't think we have any further questions, so thanks very much.